Use the Observatory of Economic Complexity's export-import tables to kind of try to show as quickly as possible what is it that Australia and New Zealand exports, imports, and who do they trade with. And we're going to find something that's quite interesting. We typically think of high-income, wealthy countries like Australia and New Zealand that have high GDP per capita, also have high positive net migration, meaning more people are coming there. They're coming there for a reason. They're moving there because there's jobs. And so typically we think of these areas as also being places that manufacture high-tech stuff. Manufacture cars, CAT scan machines. But in the case of Australia and New Zealand, what they're exporting, they're not exporting high-tech products. Instead, they're often exporting primary sector, raw material. And so we see, in this case, what does Australia export in 2015? All this being 100%, 20% of what they export is iron ore, and 16% coal briquettes. But if we just go ahead and group all this together, essentially mineral products is over half of what Australia exports to the rest of the world. Now, just for comparative case, let's look at the United States, and we're exporting high-tech stuff. I mean, we're machines, transportation, chemical products, and what are those individual things? We're manufacturing cars, planes, helicopters, gas turbines, computer integrated circuits, telephones, all kinds of telecom stuff, all kinds of other high-tech stuff. Also chemical, pharmaceuticals, medical stuff, so stents, all kinds of medical devices, medical instruments. So we're exporting high-tech stuff, where in the case of Australia and New Zealand, a little bit more lower tech in terms of raw materials. So this is one reason we see the GDP per capita is kind of high, is it's a lot of it's stuff that's happening way out in the middle of nowhere. So they're oil rich, but there's not a lot of people. And so in this case, they're iron ore rich or coal rich. And so we can look in particular, well, who are they exporting this iron ore to? And so we can look a little bit in depth. Where does Australia export iron ore to? And overwhelmingly, where are they exporting iron ore to? China. Over nearly 80% of their exports of iron ore go to China. What is that? Iron ore is key for steel. So iron ore is key for producing steel. And in China, they're building stuff left and right, urban areas left and right, factories all over the place, neighborhoods all over the place, roads, cars, and there's a lot of steel in cars. So get to the moral of the story, Andy. China is a big importer of Australian iron ore, which is crucial for steel. But you look at, go back, you look in terms of coal, a little bit different pattern. In terms of coal exports, those aren't overwhelmingly going to China. Why? China's already got its own coal. It doesn't need coal. It doesn't need to import it. But Japan, India, they most certainly do. And so, coal being used as an energy source is mostly what this is being used for, because of it being shorter amounts there in fast-growing India, economically growing India, but also economically very developed Japan and South Korea. So let's go to now what's Australia import. Essentially, it imports stuff that typically you would think high-income countries would be exporting. So they import a lot of that stuff that's made in the United States: computers, cars, and this more high-tech stuff. Medical devices we see there, medical instruments, chemical, so medical. Chemical stuff, pharmaceuticals. And so a little bit there in terms of oil and petroleum. They do import stuff, especially if they can find it cheaper. But we see a much different pattern than what we would expect. We typically expect countries like Australia to be importing a lot of raw materials to produce computers and cars. Raw materials, oil, iron ore, coal, importing that so that they can then produce, steel buildings and all of that, but also use coal to power as an energy source. Now let's look at Where they're importing from, they're importing mostly from China, but also United States. So United States, definitely, Australia imports more stuff from the United States than they export to the United States. Go back to where your stuff comes from assignment. There wasn't much Australia or New Zealand. Now let's look at New Zealand. What do they export? And here they export animal products, foodstuffs, wood. We're talking very simple stuff, very much raw materials. And so this is very much agricultural based. So overwhelmingly it's dairy. Dairy is the big thing in New Zealand in terms of their key export. And go back to previously we looked at what are the agricultural patterns in New Zealand. A lot of grazing, and a lot of that grazing is dairy, cows that are used for, in this case, milk and butter. So interesting pattern here. Where are they exporting milk to? Typically we think of milk being exported to nearby places, but not the case really with New Zealand. I don't know much about my concentrated milk, but it's actually exported all across the world, all across parts of Asia and the Middle East. And so you look at New Zealand, has a lot more trading relationships with maybe, I don't know if I say obscure, but places that are more peripheral on the global economy, economic core. We don't typically think of the Middle East or South America, but in the case of New Zealand, they have a little bit more trading relationships with these other areas that aren't in the economic core. Going back to other stuff in which New Zealand exports sheep and goat meat, but also frozen bovine meat, steaks. So you look at, where are they exporting sheep and goats to? They're actually exporting back to the motherland, actually exporting back to the United Kingdom, Europe, and so you see stuff that you don't find in abundance there being exported. And so refrigeration and the global transportation and how it's just improved considerably has changed the game. As now, shipping sheep and goat meat from one side of the world to the other, it's obviously not going to go bad. So you look at what they're exporting. They're exporting a lot more food and agricultural products. In terms of Australia and New Zealand trading back and forth with each other, what are they trading with each other? Mostly just agricultural products, food, wine. Occasionally you might see, there are a few Australian car manufacturers that might export to New Zealand, but for the most part they're just exporting and importing with each other, stuff that you would think of within the same country would be exported and imported. Or essentially think of them being in the same country. They're just obviously separated by a little bit of water. So it's the same thing that we see in the United States. We've got California exporting certain food and vegetables, the South producing certain food and vegetables, the Corn Belt. Well, in the case of Australia and New Zealand, they're also doing the same thing, which the different livestock regions, different agriculture regions, and so forth.